might get started. So my name's Lauren Davies. I'm one of the Aboriginal liaison officers at Parliament of New South Wales. Just in regards to some logistics, the reason why we're holding the event here at the State Library is because there are some critical works going on at the Parliament. If you're looking for the ladies or the gentlemen toilets, restrooms, they are just on the way out, how you came through, and across the hallway. Today the event will be videoed, so if you have any issues with being identified, please just let one of our staff members know so that we can move you into a different seat. So that's about it in terms of logistics. I will ask our acting CEO of the Department of Parliamentary Services, Julie Langsworth, to open the event.
Indeed. A round of applause for Lauren because she's pulled this all together with the assistance of the team. So yeah, thank you, Lauren, so much. Good evening, everyone. And gee, it's lovely to see so many people in the room to hear this wonderful talk. And I'll introduce our presenters shortly. So as Lauren said, my name's Julie Langsworth. I am currently sort of heading up the Department of Parliamentary Services, but my regular job, which I do love, is working together with this wonderful communication, education and engagement team. And I'll be back there next week and I'm happy about that. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people. I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders, past and present. I would also like to celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connection to land and waterways of New South Wales. When we reflect on the importance of the acknowledgement, particularly in the place that we all work, the Parliament, it is really important to note that there has been laws passed over the couple of centuries that we've been around, which really have deeply impacted on the lives of Aboriginal people, right? And many of these laws have been discriminatory and have involved dispossession and the like. I must say much has been done to reconcile this part of our history, and recent examples is the languages legislation that passed the New South Wales Parliament, and a really important events that have been hosted like this, but also like an event we hosted last year, After Sorry, where we commemorated the 25th anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations, and it really was a very moving event. The Parliament does continue to make laws that impact on everyone, and while we work to support this and continue the journey of our learning, it is important to remember that the decisions we make today not only impact on Aboriginal people but us all. We hope for a more positive future will be achieved as we do learn from the past. It is therefore appropriate that the Parliamentary Education and Engagement team is putting together a talk today on the past, present and potential future barriers to full political enfranchisement of Aboriginal peoples. And it is my pleasure to be here tonight to officially open this second event of the Election 2023 series, Silent History, Aboriginal Suffrage in New South Wales. Tonight's event will focus on the rights to vote in state elections and how indirect legislative, systemic and procedural barriers combine over many years to disenfranchise Aboriginal people and limit their participation in democracy, which is shocking. To discuss the past, present and potential future barriers to full potential enfranchisement of Aboriginal peoples, you will hear from Corey Smith, Nyamba Man, and is also the project coordinator for Towards Truth at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, PIAC, and Adam Phelan, a Barunjung Man, the stakeholder engagement and communication lead at the New South Wales Electoral Commission. Lauren, who you've met earlier, one of our Aboriginal liaison officers, has worked really closely with Mr Smith at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre to create a timeline resource to present today in regard to Aboriginal participation and democracy. It wasn't that long ago that we actually didn't have any these specialist roles. The Aboriginal Liaison Officer had made an incredible contribution to our Parliament. What the change we have seen in the last couple of years with Stephen Collins and Lauren in our team has been really profound. And I really do want to acknowledge the work that they've done here tonight. So we are delighted to have those two officers, as I've said, as we do address the institution's own barriers. But right now, you've heard enough from me. Let me get to the stage, if you wouldn't mind. Mr. Corey Smith, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a lawyer, who has worked primarily in NGOs and academia. Project coordinator, as I said, for Towards Truth project at the PIAC, Public Interest Advocacy Centre, and he supports truth-telling for First Nations people in response to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I have absolutely no doubt tonight will be highly engaging, informative for everybody here. I sincerely hope you enjoy it, and look forward to hearing your questions and comments as we go through. But now, Mr. Smith, come and join us on the stage. Thank you, everybody.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start tonight by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, and I pay my respects to the elders both past and present. I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples here today and to my non-Indigenous brothers and sisters in the audience. You've heard a little bit about me. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. My name is Corey Smith. I'm a proud Nemba man, and I've been working at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, or PIAC, for the past 2 years on the Towards Truth project. For those of you that don't know, PIAC is a social justice organisation. We have a client focus that includes legal representation for criminal law matters, people that are homeless, and matters of discrimination law, as well as First Nations justice. We also have a policy focus to change laws that cause injustice and inequality, and that is where Towards Truth largely falls under, but specifically in relation to truth and accountability. So over the past 3 years on the Towards Truth project, we've been mapping laws and policies that have impacted Aboriginal people since 1788. It's a very ambitious project. Our current focus is on laws and policies in New South Wales, and we're doing this in partnership with the NSW Indigenous Law Centre. We currently have a staging website, and we're going to be launching it to the public later this year. We're close to finalising participation in court, housing, land rights, laws and policies that have impacted Aboriginal people in relation to child removals, languages, and participation in democracy. And we'll continue to add other important subject matter over the coming years. The purpose of Towards Truth is to support the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which calls for voice, treaty, and truth. Voice being a constitutionally enshrined representative body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so we can be heard on laws and policies that impact us. Treaty is about agreement making between government and First Nations peoples, and truth is something that arose naturally out of Uluru dialogues through conversations with Indigenous communities. I won't speak for all Aboriginal people, but certainly many people in my community, myself included, feel that Australia and its people do not properly understand or appreciate the treatment of First Nations since the beginning of colonisation. We haven't properly been educated about it as a country. I certainly received very little education about it in school. So that's really a bit of background of Towards Truth. We're creating this resource for Indigenous communities as part of their own truth-telling processes. It's also going to be a resource for the general public, which is how this education piece on Aboriginal suffrage in New South Wales came about. So we've been working with the New South Wales Parliament over the last few years, specifically in relation to accessing parliamentary documents, and we're very thankful for that level of support. The research that informs this timeline that I'm about to present was put together by our project, and what we found in Aboriginal people when voting in New South Wales is actually quite surprising. Essentially, although Aboriginal people in New South Wales weren't prevented from voting based on their race, other legal technicalities were often used to exclude Aboriginal people from participating in democracy. So please just bear with me throughout the talk. Parts are going to include legal technicalities, but that's just how the law operated at the time with respect to Aboriginal people in New South Wales. I've tried to include anecdotes throughout, so I'm not just quoting bits of legislation to you. The timeline also jumps a bit back and forth on specific disqualifications, but again, that's just how the law operated, and perhaps it still does operate in that sense. It can be slow at times, it can be a bit contradictory, but I'll get to the slides now. So from the beginning, we know and we respect that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders had complex laws that sustained them for tens of thousands of years and still sustains them today. These laws naturally fall a bit outside of the scope of our project as it is pre-1788, so I'm not going to speak on these matters without cultural authority. I'll leave these to the cultural experts. These events, though, I can speak to. So starting in 1786, Captain Arthur Phillip was given his first commission, appointing him governor of our territory called New South Wales. This is what he was told by the UK Parliament at the time. You are to endeavour by every possible means to open an intercourse with the natives, excuse the colonial language, and to conciliate their affections, enjoying all our subjects to live in amity and kindness with them. And if any of our subjects shall want, only destroy them or give them any unnecessary interruption in the exercise of their several occupations, it is our will and pleasure that you do cause such offenders to be brought to punishment according to the degree of their offence. These were the orders of the UK Parliament, and it's a regular theme that we see throughout our research, where colonists were ordered to do one thing but ended up doing something completely different. It's particularly evident in the suffrage timeline during the 19th century. So during the first 35 years of the New South Wales colony, it was completely under governor rule. The only superior authority, the UK Parliament, was over 20,000 kilometres away, which is about 8 months by sea at the time. Communications were naturally slow and infrequent. Governors used wide powers during this time period, regularly going outside of what was intended by the UK. And to give you a bit of sense of this, during the early 1800s, Governor Macquarie, for example, created a legal regulation called the Regulation of the Aborigines, a genius title. Through this regulation, he created a native institution at Parramatta, where a yearly feast would actually take place to attract Aboriginal parents and their children. The purpose of the institution was to separate Aboriginal children from their parents, teach them English, and teach them industry skills like carpentry. Governor Brisbane used the same regulations to create an institution in Blacktown. So the governor really had immense power to the establishment, prior to the establishment of Legislative Council. I think that's really important to note because Aboriginal people, like everyone in New South Wales at the time, couldn't vote. That's despite laws, like I mentioned, directly and specifically being aimed at them on the basis of their race. 1823, this is when the New South Wales Legislative Council was established, and it was the first parliament to be established in Australia. It wasn't like the parliament that we know today. The primary purpose of the law that actually created the Legislative Council was to regulate the courts and the judiciary in New South Wales. The Legislative Council was made up of between 5 to 7 men who would advise the governor on making laws for the colony. The men weren't democratically elected. They were appointed to their positions by the governor. And perhaps unsurprisingly, no Aboriginal man formed part of this advisory group. The governor could also overrule them when making law for the colony, so the governor still had ultimate power. The Chief Justice would then attempt to ensure that the laws were consistent with the UK. So this period was more a bit a stepping stone, I guess, towards responsible government in New South Wales, even though people, including Aboriginal people, were unable to vote for their representatives. The UK then passed the New South Wales Constitution Act in 1842, which created the first representative legislature. It was actually semi-representative because the Legislative Council at the time was composed of 36 members. 24 were elected by the people, the remaining 12 were still appointed by the New South Wales Governor. And government appointments were always expected to support the governor. So really the governor only needed about 6 of the 24 members to support any law, any bill. It also wasn't responsible government as we know it today because the governor still had strong influence over New South Wales laws, in that if he disagreed with the Legislative Council, he could refer the law to the UK, which could end up frustrating the process for months and years. To vote for the 24 members, though, a person in New South Wales had to own property of a certain value, it was £200 at the time, or occupy a house worth £20 annually. Only men aged 21 or over could vote. So technically, under the law at the time, an Aboriginal man who was aged 21 or over, who owned property of a certain value or occupied a house of a certain value could have voted. We don't have any evidence of that happening at the time, but we're happy to be proved wrong on that. It's certainly, if it did happen, it would have been the exception. It was definitely not the rule. Contextually, many Aboriginal people at this time are either living traditionally or being moved onto missions, stations and reserves and having their lives controlled by government. The first election was in 1843. There was actually a riot in the city on the day, so the people weren't happy about this form of government. In 1855, law was then introduced to make New South Wales bicameral, so we'd have two parliamentary houses, including the Legislative Assembly. It sat for the first time in 1856. It was all democratically elected, but the Legislative Council still had appointments, and voting was still dependent on those property or those ownership dwelling requirements, which applied to Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people alike. The Legislative Council wasn't directly elected until 1978, making it the longest non-elected house in Australia. 1858, this was actually a really big year from a voting perspective. Things started to change. So those requirements in relation to the property and property ownership or property dwellings for any man over 21 was removed. Instead, if you were a man aged over 21 and you lived in New South Wales for at least 3 years, then you could start to vote. More than likely, these changes would have benefited miners or people who came to New South Wales during the gold rush period to vote. Still, in removing the requirement, it meant that Aboriginal men 21 and over living in New South Wales could have voted for government. And there is actually evidence of this happening during the 19th century, which was quite surprising for us. Some Aboriginal men were voting at this point in time. Again, though, it's more that exception rather than the rule. For the most part, Aboriginal people weren't actively encouraged to enrol, and few would have known about their rights to vote under New South Wales law. Also importantly, in 1858, voting enrolment changed through the introduction of certain disqualifications. So anyone who'd be convicted of a crime was barred from voting unless they'd received a pardon. And as we know, Aboriginal people have been and continue to be overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Also relevantly for Aboriginal people, anyone at the time who was in receipt of aid from any charitable institution was disqualified from voting. I know that sounds like a really funny phrase, but it mattered a lot. Why did it matter? It mattered because the interpretation of the law at the time meant that Aboriginal people who were forced to live on government reserves and stations were considered to be in receipt of aid, and therefore they were disqualified from voting under this law. Regarding Aboriginal people and voting in the later parts of the 19th century, a debate actually took part in Parliament in 1875. No member actually knew of anyone in their district who was Aboriginal and voting, and to me I think that's more evidence that Aboriginal people voting was the exception and it wasn't common practice. There was lower voter awareness at the time, and participation in that sense makes sense to me because of the previous property requirements and then the introduction of this charitable aid disqualification. In 1902, this was a really big year. There was constitutional debates leading up to the Federation of Australia, and the debates kind of centred on whether Aboriginal people could have the right to vote at the federal level. It was particularly an issue for states like Queensland and Western Australia, where Aboriginal people were barred from voting just based on their race. This is reflected at the federal level in 1902, so Aboriginal people were barred from voting. It said, "No Aboriginal native of Australia, Asia, Africa, or the islands of the Pacific, except New Zealand, shall be entitled to have his name placed on an electoral roll, unless so entitled under Section 41 of the Constitution." Bear with me here. In practice, what this meant is that an Aboriginal person in New South Wales could only vote at the federal level if they were enrolled to vote in New South Wales prior to 1901. It's a convoluted way of kind of ensuring that Aboriginal people throughout Australia and certain states are disenfranchised at the federal level. And again, we don't have any evidence of Aboriginal people voting federally at this time, but again, we're happy to be proven wrong. Importantly though, this law proved very influential over Aboriginal people in New South Wales, and that kind of makes sense to me. If I'm not allowed to vote for federal parliament because I'm not enrolled in New South Wales prior to 1901, I would feel completely excluded from democracy, and I doubt very much that I would be enrolling to vote at the state level in New South Wales after that time. This changed slightly in 1918, whereby if an Aboriginal person enrolled to vote in New South Wales from 1918 onwards, then they could actually vote at the federal level. I know that's a lot of info to take in, but the important part really is to remember that the federal law at the time proved very influential over Aboriginal people and voting in New South Wales. Also in that year, voting rights were extended to women in New South Wales, and Australia was actually quite ahead of its time in that regard. This would have legally enfranchised Aboriginal women in New South Wales. So an Aboriginal woman could have voted in New South Wales during this time period, but keep in mind those charitable aid disqualifications are still in place. In 1903, the Aborigines Protection Association were actually a bit confused themselves. They didn't understand if Aboriginal people who they had responsibility and control over, who were living on reserves and stations, were actually entitled to enrol to vote. So they actually sought legal advice from the New South Wales Crown Solicitor. His advice to the Protection Board was that, and I'm quoting this, Aborigines in receipt of rations or other assistance at the time of making out the list or the holding of an election cannot vote. As a typical lawyer, though, the Crown Solicitor did leave a loophole. He said that every case should be decided according to its own peculiar circumstances. For the most part, though, what this meant, it meant that if you're an Aboriginal person at the time, you've been removed from your homelands, your culture's been taken away, you can't speak your language, your children have been removed, and you're forced to live on a government reserve where you're given some form of housing and rations, where you can't vote in an election for the parliament that legalised all of that. 1912, suffrage was then extended to prisoners in New South Wales. It wasn't extended to all prisoners, it was just to people who were in prison serving a sentence of less than 12 months, so they were technically able to enrol to vote. And this continued throughout the 20th century. Although the amendment to the law might have technically extended that right to vote to some people in prison, in practice many remained disenfranchised as they didn't have access to postal voting. So this would have included any Aboriginal person who was imprisoned at the time. 1928, this was quite a big year in terms of that charitable aid disqualification, because after a long period of debate, the law was actually changed in this year, so the disqualification for people in receipt of aid was removed altogether. So relevantly for Aboriginal people in New South Wales, this meant that they couldn't be barred from voting just because they lived on a government reserve or a station. So theoretically, this might have encouraged some Aboriginal people to enrol to vote. And also in that year, compulsory voting was introduced in New South Wales, and this would have applied to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people alike. 1962, this was a very important year at the federal level. It's a bit of a common misconception that the 1967 referendum gave Aboriginal people the federal right to vote. It actually happened in 1962, which is still shockingly late in my opinion. Federal voting rights in this year were extended to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think this is the key year for Aboriginal people participating in democracy in New South Wales. And again, if you just think about this logically, it makes sense. If I'm told that all Aboriginal people in Australia are now allowed to vote at the federal level, then that would motivate me more to participate in democracy, both at the national and at the state level. There was still a bit of a funny scenario in some states, such as Queensland. Even though Aboriginal people couldn't vote in their state election in Queensland, they could vote at the federal level, and that continued until 1965 in Queensland. Postal voting was changed in 1977 because I mentioned earlier that prisoners didn't have access to an established system of postal voting. It wasn't until 1977 that the law was extended to include postal voting for people serving a prison sentence in New South Wales. And as Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the prison population, Aboriginal people would have been disproportionately affected by the lack of postal voting in the 20th century. And remember too, it's still only Aboriginal people serving a prison sentence of less than 12 months who can vote. This was really interesting in 1983. I had no idea about this, but even though Aboriginal people were actually given the right to vote at the federal level in 1962, it wasn't until 1983 that it was compulsory for Aboriginal people to vote. A decision was kind of made at the time to exempt Aboriginal people from compulsory voting, and part of the reason given was that by making it compulsory, well, that could have opened up Aboriginal people to fines for not voting. And considering Aboriginal people did not have a coherent history, as we've kind of learned tonight, of participating in democracy, that's sort of the reasoning that was given why it wasn't compulsory for them to vote. But this changed in 1983. And I mean, that's just so shockingly recent. 1983 until Aboriginal people, until it was compulsory for them to vote and participate in democracy. We're almost there. I've got a couple of slides left. I've put in this case of ROACH. It's a bit more of a anecdote in a sense. ROACH was a federal case, so it only applied to federal voting, but I thought it was just really interesting, and it kind of speaks to the history of Aboriginal people challenging decisions and laws made by the government at the time. So this did only apply to federal laws, but essentially what the government was trying to do is that they were attempting to change the law at the federal level so that people who were serving a prison sentence would be disqualified from voting for Commonwealth Parliament. The plaintiff, Vicky Lee Roach, she was Aboriginal and she was serving a prison sentence at the time. She challenged the law and she won. The court found that the law would have banned people who were serving a prison sentence from voting. They found that it was unconstitutional. They found, however, it was valid to disqualify people serving a prison sentence only of 3 years or less. So voting in elections really lies at the heart of the system of representative government, and disenfranchisement of a group of adult citizens without a substantial reason would not be consistent with that, and that's what the court found. In his judgment, interestingly, Justice Hayne specifically referenced that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So any laws that could have impacted on people in the criminal justice system would have a disproportionate impact on Aboriginal people. And the Australian Human Rights Commission has written that restrictions on the right of prisoners to vote also exclude a disproportionate number of Indigenous Australians from voting, and that the disproportionate impacts of the prisoners' voting restrictions on Indigenous peoples may actually amount to racial discrimination under international human rights law. So knowing a bit about the history of Aboriginal people voting in New South Wales, it's probably not all that surprising that Aboriginal people as a group have lower voting enrolments than non-Aboriginal people. This has been known to Parliament for some time, and a little over a decade ago, to address barriers to voting for Aboriginal people, the New South Wales Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommended in 2012 that specific measures be set up to reduce barriers. These included things like more advertising in Aboriginal media on voting, instructions on voting for Aboriginal communities, and encouraging Aboriginal people to work at elections. Other measures to improve participation have included alternative ways to vote. It includes options like vote via post, iVote, and mobile polling booths in some rural and remote areas. I think more still needs to be done in that sense, though, to ensure that Aboriginal people are participating in democracy at the same rate as their non-Aboriginal peers. This is the last slide. Okay, so under the Electoral Act in 2017, which is the current law, people serving a prison sentence less than 12 months can vote, but if you're serving any more than that, the law hasn't changed in that regard at all since 1912. And given that overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system, Aboriginal people continue to be disproportionately vulnerable to losing their voting entitlements because of that restriction. I know that's a lot of info, but that's really the story of when it comes to Aboriginal people voting in New South Wales, starting with that semi-representative government technically being allowed to vote under the law in the later parts of the 19th century, but also being regularly disqualified due to living on stations and reserves, and also that important piece of federal legislation in 1902 and 1962. I really think that these types of historical truths and these resources are important. They help us understand one another. They can contribute to important conversations like voice and treaty, and I can really understand why so many First Nations people have been asking for truth-telling in this country for a long time. It's a way for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to meet. And I always think back to Auntie Pat Anderson from the Uluru Dialogues. She talks about how the Uluru Statement, its calls for voice, treaty, and truth, they can help us walk taller. We can start to walk taller with truth-telling. And if it's done properly, we can start to reimagine how laws can actually empower First Nations people for the benefit of us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was incredible, and I'm sure, I know myself, I learn a lot with working with PIAC and learning about the history, because I had only an understanding of the federal kind of system. So I'll ask Mr. Adam Phelan, for the Stakeholder Engagement and Communications Lead from the New South Wales Electoral Commission, to join us as we start a panel discussion. I've got a few questions already lined up, but if the audience would like to think of a few more, if we have time, we'll open it up to you guys. Okay, so Adam, we'll start with you. What is the importance of specific engagement and outreach with Aboriginal communities on elections and voting, and how can it support Aboriginal voter participation?
Yeah, so I think Corey's great history just then that we all sat through, and I still learn a lot as well, even being at the Commission, the New South Wales Electoral Commission. I think that history gives the context as to why it's so important that there is specific community engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for us in New South Wales, but also nationally. And I think it's good to remember that history is lived. So it's tied to our families and communities, particularly out of the protection era as well. So communities that come out from missions and reserves, and that's important from an engagement perspective. And it sort of demonstrates too the unique position Aboriginal people have in Australia and Australian history. So it's no surprise when general media campaigns and advertising and information isn't overly effective for getting Aboriginal people out to vote and enrol. So the Australian Electoral Commission, I'm in the New South Wales body, and we're actually completely separate statutory bodies. The AEC do the federal elections and referendums, and we do the state elections for the New South Wales Parliament, and also provide services for the local government. And so it's through the mechanics of community that you can actually make some difference, and the AEC have sort of led that space for quite some time through their Indigenous and Education Participation program that's been quite long-standing. And so for us, because we're a bit smaller in that engagement space in terms of resources, really through collaboration with the AEC, because we also are all working towards the same goal. So there's a working group that has representatives from all different commissions to work towards strategies at that community level. So, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Corey, are there any stories from your research that helps illustrate the difference between the legal right to vote and the actual enrolment of Aboriginal people in New South Wales?
Thank you for that question. It's really an interesting one, and it's a bit of a challenge in a sense on our project, because the focus is on the laws and policies themselves, and that was really what my talk focused on. But a lot of the time you can have a law and a policy that can be very different to what's actually happening in practice. We try to address this as best that we can, so when we have the website up and live, we will summarise laws and policies for people, for communities. We're also going to provide them with case studies and resources. So the case studies that we're going to have up on the website, they're publicly accessible, but basically what the information is going to do is it's going to show people what was actually happening to certain Aboriginal people and communities at the time that a law and policy was in place. We also have discussion and analysis materials, so those are things like academic articles and experts who are commenting on the law and policy at the time to give that extra level of nuance. In relation specifically to Aboriginal people's right to vote, like I mentioned at the start of my talk, we're actually quite surprised by what we found. So even though, for example, in 1928, the charitable aid disqualification's gone, Aboriginal people are now, it's now compulsory for them to vote. There was a report done by a select committee in 1961, and what they found was between 1928 and 1961, those 33 years, even though there was 1,042 Aboriginal people who were living on stations at the time, there's only 457 of them who were voting, and that's despite the fact that the law at the time says that it's compulsory for them to vote. Similarly, in the later part of the 19th century, there's an author, Jim Smith, and he's gone back through the archives and he's had a look at any people who were Aboriginal who were voting in the late 19th century. That's how we know that people were voting. You'd read the law and you'd think something like a charitable aid disqualification. Why would something like that be relevant? Jim Smith's kind of picked that up and he said, well, actually, this has impacted Aboriginal people on stations and reserves. In spite of that, there were still Aboriginal people who were able to vote at the time, but that's because they're living on more unmanaged reserves, so they don't have that government kind of authority there who's ordering their day-to-day lives. And that's why we have Aboriginal people in the later part of the 19th century who are voting. And we come across these stories all the time, and it just kind of reminds me that the law can only do so much. I think it's a lot of these things can actually go down to how do we want to treat each other? Do we want to treat each other with dignity or respect, or are we going to be giving into these racist attitudes at the time? And I think that's still relevant today.
Thank you. Adam, what measures or initiatives are being employed by the New South Wales Electoral Commission to help mitigate the barriers and challenges faced by many Aboriginal communities in New South Wales in regards to voting?
Yes, and very timely because as of today, the election is this month, which is quite crazy. It's come up quite quick. So on the 25th, the election will be, and from the 18th for early voting. The Commission's doing a number of initiatives. So some of them have been happening since 2012, which Corey spoke to in terms of using Aboriginal media and that sort of targeted campaigns. But also in terms of the in-person voting experience, there's some movement in that area too. So one thing is sort of a more proactive procurement of Aboriginal corporations and centres as voting centres. And that plays sort of a broader role of having a much more familiar and welcoming space for local Aboriginal people to be able to go and vote in, be familiar with it. And it has a sort of dual role too, I think, because we also want a lot of Aboriginal people working in voting centres and representing the diversity of the communities we live in. And having those centres means it's more likely you're going to want to work in that voting centre, and then, and it's obviously open to the whole community as well, so that has a broader role of the whole community coming into those centres. But also because a lot of Aboriginal people face additional barriers due to overrepresentation in different ways, and one of that's through being overrepresented as people either at risk or experiencing homelessness as well. So we're doing a number of different engagements on that front, including with the Newtown Neighbourhood Centre to do sort of weekly engagements, chatting to people that might be at risk, because there's particularly enrolments and everything you can do around that as well. And we'll keep doing the engagement work as well, and there's a lot more, I think, over time we can keep improving from our perspective.
Thank you. And last one for me for Corey. What role can Towards Truth play in addressing these past and current challenges?
I think the biggest way that we're contributing is through the research itself. So the things that I talked about tonight, that was based on a subject that we're going to have up on the website. And the subject, what we try to do is try to summarise those laws and policies in about 500 to 1,000 words. We try not to be too legally technical about it, but we're not trying to do the truth-telling ourselves. We're just trying to get the information out there so it can actually be used by First Nations peoples as part of their own truth-telling processes. And we're kind of figuring out the technical parts of the website at the moment. But we had a research assistant, he recently started with us, and his granddad had a look at the website today. And the stuff on there it can be quite confronting. But at the same time, when he interacted with the material, he was able to speak his truth. And I think that's going to be the real power of it when we finally launch it. Separately, I know for myself and people in my community, I think Towards Truth is a bit of a symbol of hope. I remember I talked to my mum last year, and mum grew up in a really remote town, Brewarrina, and it was tough. There's not employment opportunities, there's not education opportunities. Her dad grew up on the mission. She lost her mum when she was very young, and her grandma, my maternal grandmother, was the one that looked after her. She was an Aboriginal lady, and mum would tell me stories of how when she grew up, her own grandmother, who's Aboriginal, would tell her, "We're not black. You can't spend time with Aboriginal people. You gotta watch how you act outside." And that's a hard thing. That's a really hard thing for my mum to grow up with. And she kind of had that on her heart, I think, for years. And when she told me this, I know what's actually happening at the political and at the legal level at the time, because during the mid-20th century, you would actually have something called exemption certificates. And so if you acted in a certain way, that could give you access to health, that can give you access to education, can give you access to employment opportunities. So these things that my mum grew up with and what she heard, those weren't choices being made by her. Those weren't choices being made by my maternal grandmother. It's something that's been mandated in law and policy at the time. And when you hear something like that and telling my mum that, it can kind of free you from, I guess, these voices that you hear growing up, that it's kind of all your fault that, the life's turned out this way. It's not that case. It hasn't been that case for First Nations people throughout our history. It's not the case for First Nations people now. And so I think in that way, the Towards Truth project and the information that we're getting out there can be a really great resource for communities in that respect.
Thank you. I might ask Scarlett to come grab my mic. They can move around for any questions the audience may have. And I understand Zach has already put his hand up, so...
Thank you to the speakers. Really learn a lot from your presentations. My question relates to treaty at state level. So now with treaties processes increasingly being implemented around the country, Queensland, Northern Territory, Victoria, where it all started, and others, and potentially in New South Wales, depending on which way the election goes, we could see treaty here. Do you see a treaty process potentially facilitating greater democratic participation for Aboriginal communities in this state?
Thank you for that question. It's interesting that you raised treaty, because the Uluru Statement obviously sequences things as voice, treaty and truth. Working on the project, though, you kind of see how those three kind of all link together, particularly in relation to truth-telling, because in a sense, when you're mapping out laws and policies that have impacted Aboriginal people since 1788, you're actually showing evidence of what happens to people when they don't have a say on matters that impact them. In regards to treaty, I'm not an expert in relation to treaties specifically, but I think that Towards Truth and the truth-telling of the laws and policies could be something very useful as part of that process and negotiating with a government. I think that it would prove very useful for that process, and particularly in relation to participating in democracy.
I'm actually Aboriginal from Gamilaroi. My question is, in your research, the government policy with the colour line, what was the definition of being an Aboriginal? Like, I saw something with The Voice. I'm an advocate for The Voice. And I saw a Liberal politician talking about if you've got 5% Aboriginal, can you be on the committee? Now, looking at that population in the graph that you've had up there, I suspect there were a lot of Aboriginal people were identified as being white through the simulation policies. And the other thing I suspect is, were Aboriginals counted? They were counted on the missions. What about the ones who were living in the suburbs and that? Were they white, counted as white, or were they black? Because I think that there, on a high level, it looks good, but when you get deeper down, you'll see other things that happen and why Aboriginal people will not vote or even admit that they are Aboriginal. And I just wonder what come in the research, you know, like the colour line is, if you study this type of thing, there are people in our society that believe because you're white, you're not Aboriginal. So you can't vote as an Aboriginal. So this line, it actually makes me angry a bit when we talk about this stuff.
No, thank you for your question. I think that's certainly something that we're going to map out once we get to those particular subject matter. In relation to voting, it is this frustrating thing. I experienced it myself when you look at the laws and the policies in New South Wales when it's technically not done in relation to race when it came to voting in New South Wales. The tricky part of that is that in practice, like you say, you're not really having access to participation democracy. So it might say something in the law that no longer Aboriginal people aren't disqualified because they're no longer living. It doesn't matter if they're living on stations and reserves, but whoever it came up to on the day when you went to vote, that person would be in charge on whether they're going to accept you to put your name on the roll.
So it's the Electoral Commission's role to accept you as being an Aboriginal?
On the day of enrolment, that's really where the power's gone to, and it's very difficult for us to say for certain how many Aboriginal people were attempting to put their name on the roll. I know in Queensland it was race legislation. It was that in the law. I read something, funnily enough, today. There was a lady in Queensland whose grandmother, just on the basis of the fact that she had fairer skin, it's the same as my youngest brother, he has fair skin, he's still Aboriginal. But because her grandmother had fairer skin, she was allowed on the day by the electoral commissioner to enrol to vote. But the lady herself, because she had darker skin, they said, no, sorry.
Hi, thank you for this evening. It was really interesting. I've been trying to encourage Aboriginal people to vote, and I've come across a number of issues which I suspect you're aware of. Probably the most common reason that people don't vote is that they don't have a birth certificate, and we've all been trying to address this particular issue for the last few years. The second one is when I'm talking to people from the stolen generation, they're very fearful of having their address on an electoral roll, and that carries down through the generations with intergenerational trauma. They're quite fearful of people having an address because of their history of the children being taken away. Then the other one that comes up a lot, because Tramby was formed in 1957, it's the oldest continuously operating Aboriginal organisation Aboriginal-owned organisation in Australia, 1957. We just had our 65th birthday. We do education. So one of the things that is also an issue for Aboriginal people is low levels of literacy. So it's very difficult to vote if you can't actually read the form. And we've worked certainly in the last Commonwealth election, I spent a lot of time talking to people trying to encourage them to enrol, and overcoming the fears that they had if they did enrol, the issues that they had. We've also got a number of people from Tranby who have registered with New South Wales Electoral Commission to go and help in this election. But they're just some of the things that we see, because we're dealing with Aboriginal people every day and we're trying to encourage them to be engaged in the political process. But I'm sure you know most of this, but it was just important to understand some of the reasons. It's not just the legislation, there's a whole range of other things as well.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that. Thanks for sharing, and I'll definitely chat to you after this, because we can definitely have different sort of materials and stuff that you can share through your corporation. And definitely ID has always been a barrier for Aboriginal people in all different forms. Birth certificates are part of that. There has been, and it's at the federal level, so we have joint management, as in the Australian Electoral Commission and the New South Wales Electoral Commission has joint management, but it's through the AEC that enrolment largely occurs, and once you enrol, you're enrolled in federal, state and local government elections. But there has been some recent positive movement at that federal level for enrolment. So now they accept some additional forms of ID to enrol, including a Medicare card and a citizen certificate, I think it is. So there is some good movements there to make it a bit easier on the ID front. But yeah, and that's why it's good to work at the local level, because it's the community organisations that know the challenges for community, how to communicate best within, because there's large diversity across, even in New South Wales, with different communities. So that's why we try and connect with. So we'll definitely chat even into this election, but thanks for sharing.
My question really relates to something that seems to be embedded even beneath all of this, is what does it mean to be an Australian citizen? Because if you read the Australian Citizens Act, it's by no means clear what it means to be a citizen of Australia. And this was highlighted in a recent High Court case some time ago, where two Indigenous people who held passports, one from New Zealand, one from Papua New Guinea, the previous government, through the immigration minister, who will remain unnamed, tried to deport these people because they'd committed some crime, and they took this to the Supreme Court and then to the High Court. The High Court found by 4-3 that they could not, one of them had established without doubt his Aboriginality in a land claim. The other one could only find one person who could verify his Aboriginality. And let's leave that aside, because I think there are problems at the moment in proof of Aboriginality. I think there are huge problems in that. Leaving that to the side, the one who established Aboriginality, the High Court found by 4-3 that they could not. Now, Susan Kiefel, the Chief Justice, was in the group that said they could deport. And she simply read section 5119 of the Constitution relating the Aliens Act. What is an alien? It's not defined in the Constitution. So Parliament's defined it as a non-citizen. When you go to see what is a citizen then, you run into that circular argument that if you're an alien, you're a non-citizen, and you go to find out what is a citizen, and it's by no means clear what it is. The troubling thing to me is that, and Corey, I think that was wonderful, the historical thing that you've done. We're living in this right now, in the present, that if that, since the High Court decision, 2 judges have retired and been replaced by literalist judges who would do the same as Susan Kiefel. If you ran that same case now, without any change whatsoever, only the change in the High Court, it would likely be 4-3 and maybe 5-2 that they could be deported. Now that's scary. That Indigenous people then, through no fault of their own, by having a passport because their family moved to another country, could be deported through the High Court. So I think then that it's tremendous to look at the history, but I think at the moment that there's tremendous insecurity for Indigenous people, you know, despite the fact that in so many ways, I was reminded of this the other day, I worked on a project 30 years ago after the Royal Commission of Death in Custody. Hardly any of those recommendations were put into effect. The extent now that death in custody is worse now than when the Royal Commission was held 30 years ago. So in many ways then, even though we seem to be progressing, underneath it, I think that there's enormous shift that still has to happen. And I agree completely, the basis for this to me is truth-telling. We've got to look at, honestly, at what's happened historically and what's happening right now, including motives of government to try and deport those people despite the fact that they've shown themselves. How absurd that you could deport an original inhabitant of this nation. To even think about that shows that in some ways we haven't come that far. Yeah? Just a comment on that.
Thank you, Bill.
We have one more question.
You mentioned that in New South Wales, prisoners who are serving over 12 months don't deserve to the right to vote. If, as you said, ROACH v Commonwealth found that 3 years is the constitutional line, why is New South Wales allowed to operate under this? Like, isn't this a very crucial part in allowing Indigenous people the right to vote?
I totally agree. I was thinking about that today as well. I was thinking, why is that okay at the federal level, but we have a law that's currently in operation at the state level? I don't have a clear answer for that. Maybe it just hasn't been tested yet. And if you think about ROACH, that law could have passed. It took someone like Vicky Lee Roach to stand up and challenge it for the High Court to find that it was unconstitutional. So I thought the exact same thing, because you would be excluding hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal people because of that. I don't know what the justification is, and I don't know if anyone's tried to challenge that yet.
Sorry, I'll just, I think the current legislation has it at 5 years. So if it's less than 5 years in prison, so there's still that requirement, but I think it's 5 years from my knowledge, but yeah.
No, it is an interesting discussion, and thank you so much for participating tonight. We are running out of time, so I'll just wrap up quickly. A big thank you to both Corey and Adam for joining us tonight, and particularly with PIAC for providing such an incredible resource that we're hoping to utilise within our education team moving forward. So if everyone would like to join me in thanking them. I'd also like to thank our acting CEO, Julie Langsworth, not only for supporting the Aboriginal Liaison Officer roles, but also to try and embed Aboriginal perspectives throughout Parliament. You are a really big supporter. Same with the community engagement, communications, engagement and education team, and our graphic designer, Daniel, for helping set up this presentation and ensuring that the event tonight went smoothly. Could definitely not have done it without them. And also thank you for joining. I think the fact that I can see so many of you in the audience, and hopefully those who are going to be listening on YouTube later on, kind of showcases that these stories, these perspectives, these education programs around Aboriginal perspectives are so incredibly needed, important, and there's a huge interest. And so big thank you for you guys for joining us tonight. If you are interested in the election space, the democracy and whatnot, we do have an event coming up on the 22nd of March, and that looks at democracy in crisis and uses the United States of America as a case study and looking at democracy there. So I think that's going to be an incredible night as well. So if you want to join us in that, it'll be 22nd of March at around the same time, same venue. If you want to hear more about our programs, we do have a newsletter that you can sign up to. And if you're interested in maybe catering at Parliament or the history of Parliament as the institution, we do have 2 books being sold at the back for $50, card only. They could be a wonderful gift, and yeah, I would encourage you guys to have a look and come back, and hopefully, yeah, if you have any feedback, happy to hear about it. Thank you so much, guys.